The basement archive of the Charleston Historical Society smelled of old paper and regret, a combination of deteriorating leather bindings, oxidizing metal clasps, and the indefinable scent of time itself pressing down on forgotten documents. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her gloved fingers against the plastic sleeve protecting a daguerreotype that had been catalogued incorrectly for over a century, feeling the slight static charge that accumulated on the archival materials in the climate-controlled room. The image showed 6 young women arranged in descending height order, their faces frozen in the solemn expressions typical of 1856 photography, when exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still for up to 30 seconds. What the initial cataloguers had missed, what Sarah's team discovered when they digitized the image at high resolution using the latest photogrammetry software, would unravel a mystery that had haunted Charleston's conscience for generations and force the city to confront truths it had spent over a century and a half trying to bury beneath magnolia blossoms and carefully curated heritage tours. Sarah had moved to Charleston 3 years ago from Seattle, drawn by a research grant to study antebellum photographic documentation and the stories that early camera technology could tell about America's most brutal institution. She never imagined her work would lead here, to this moment on a humid October afternoon, staring at a screen while her assistant Marcus Washington stood rigid behind her, his breathing shallow and controlled, his hands gripping the back of her chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale. Marcus had grown up in Charleston, his family rooted in the Gullah community for 2 centuries. Their genealogy traced back through oral tradition and fragments of documentation that had survived the systematic destruction of records that accompanied slavery's end. When he first saw what the enhanced image revealed, when the computer screen showed details invisible to the naked eye, he had to leave the room, walking quickly past the shelves of archived materials and out into the bright Carolina sunshine, where he stood in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to process what he had just witnessed. The discovery happened almost by accident, which is how most historical revelations occur. Sarah had been cataloguing 19th-century photographs as part of a broader digitization project funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. The goal was to preserve Charleston's visual history before the physical materials deteriorated beyond recovery, creating a digital archive that scholars and descendants could access remotely. Most of the work was routine. She would photograph each item with specialized equipment, document the metadata, note any physical damage or unique characteristics, and move on to the next piece. Thousands of images flowed through her workspace: landscapes, family portraits, architectural documentation, commercial advertising, all the varied purposes to which early photography was applied. The daguerreotype in question had been filed under Whitmore Family Collection Miscellaneous Portraits, circa 1850-1860. The catalogue card, yellowed and brittle, described it simply as 6 daughters of the Whitmore household, formal portrait. Sarah had no reason to question this description initially. She set up the photograph under her digital camera array, adjusted the lighting to minimize glare from the reflective silver surface characteristic of daguerreotypes, and began the capture process. The resulting image, at 10 times the resolution of the human eye, revealed details that no one had noticed in over 160 years. Marcus had been in the room organizing boxes of Civil War-era correspondence when Sarah called him over to look at something strange. He approached the screen expecting another interesting but ultimately routine historical artifact. Instead, he found himself looking at what appeared to be evidence of his family's greatest tragedy. The 6 sisters his grandmother had told him about since childhood, the ones who vanished from Virginia in 1856 and were never seen again, might be staring back at him from a photograph that had been sitting in an archive basement less than 3 miles from where he grew up. The details emerged slowly as Sarah increased the magnification and adjusted the digital filters. First, she noticed that the background of the photograph showed what appeared to be a brick wall rather than the decorative backdrops popular in portrait studios of the era. This suggested the photograph was taken not in a professional setting, but in someone's home or property. Then she saw the shadows wrong somehow, indicating that the women were lit primarily from above by natural light rather than by the controlled illumination a photographer would have arranged. The lighting pattern suggested a basement or cellar with high windows. But it was the chains that changed everything. Around each woman's ankle, partially obscured by the hems of their simple cotton dresses, iron shackles were clearly visible at high resolution. The metal caught the light differently than the surrounding fabric, creating a telltale gleam that the daguerreotype's silver surface had captured with brutal precision. Sarah spent an hour examining each ankle, each shackle, documenting the evidence that these were not daughters posing for a family portrait, but human beings in bondage, photographed against their will for purposes that made her hands shake as she worked. That was disturbing enough to make Sarah consider calling the police, though she wasn't sure what crimes could be prosecuted a century and a half after the fact. What made Marcus leave the room? What made him walk out into the parking lot and stand there shaking in the afternoon heat? Was what Sarah found when she examined the sisters' eyes using facial recognition software, meant to help identify historical figures by comparing bone structure and facial features across multiple images. The software flagged something unusual about the women's pupils. Each sister's pupils were dilated to an unnatural degree, expanded far beyond what the lighting conditions would explain, creating a haunting, almost vacant quality to their gazes. Sarah had studied enough 19th-century medical texts to know what could cause such pronounced pupil dilation. Belladonna, a toxic plant extract, was sometimes used by photographers to dilate subjects' pupils for aesthetic purposes, creating a more doe-eyed appearance that was fashionable among wealthy white women of the era. But belladonna was expensive, and its use was typically reserved for clients who could pay premium prices for enhanced portraits. Why would someone use it on enslaved women being photographed, presumably for sale or documentation? Unless the purpose wasn't aesthetic but practical, to create a docile, disoriented state that would make the subjects easier to manage during the long exposure time required for daguerreotype photography. The software analysis revealed other details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Each woman's posture, when measured against computational biomechanical models, showed signs of physical restraint beyond the visible shackles. Their shoulders were pulled back slightly more than natural standing position would dictate, suggesting their arms might be bound behind them, hidden from the camera's view by the careful positioning of their bodies. The tension visible in their neck muscles, captured in microscopic detail by the daguerreotype's unforgiving precision, indicated they were fighting to maintain the required stillness, possibly against discomfort or pain from whatever restraints were applied. And then there was the figure in the background, partially obscured by deliberate overexposure that washed out details in the periphery of the image. At normal viewing, this area appeared to be simply poor photographic technique, an amateur's failure to properly balance the exposure across the entire frame. But at high resolution, with digital filters adjusting for the overexposure, the shape of a man emerged from the white glare. He stood to the left of the frame, holding something that analysis suggested was probably a cane or rod, positioned in a way that would have been clearly visible to the 6 women, but carefully kept just out of the photograph's primary focus. A threat, rendered almost invisible, but undoubtedly effective in maintaining the women's compliance during the exposure. Sarah printed out the enhanced images and spread them across her desk, creating a visual timeline of discovery. The original daguerreotype showed 6 well-dressed young women in what appeared to be a formal family portrait. The first enhancement revealed the shackles. The second showed the pupil dilation and postural abnormalities. The third brought the threatening figure into view. Each layer of analysis peeled back another level of deception, revealing the calculated cruelty beneath the surface of what had been catalogued as innocuous domestic documentation. Marcus returned after his break, his eyes red, but his voice steady. "I need to see it again," he said, pulling up a chair beside Sarah. They went through the enhanced images together, Sarah explaining each technical detail while Marcus absorbed the implications with the particular weight carried by those whose ancestors suffered these documented atrocities. He pointed at the third woman from the left, the one who would later be identified as Naomi. "Her eyes," he said quietly. "Look at her eyes, even dilated, even scared. There's something there. She's looking at the camera like she knows, like she understands exactly what's happening, and she wants someone, someday, to see the truth." Sarah zoomed in on Naomi's face. Marcus was right. Unlike her sisters, whose gazes seemed to drift slightly, unable to focus properly through the drug-induced dilation, Naomi's eyes looked directly into the lens, with an intensity that transcended the physical circumstances. It was a look of recognition, of awareness, of defiance, even in bondage. It was the look of someone who understood she was being reduced to property, but refused in the deepest part of herself to accept that reduction. That look, captured accidentally or perhaps intentionally by the photographer's choice of exposure time, transformed the image from a document of victimization into evidence of resistance. The photograph had been donated to the Society in 1923 by the estate of Judge Thaddeus Whitmore, a prominent Charleston family whose legacy included a grand mansion on Broad Street, numerous charitable endowments, a wing of the medical college bearing their name, and a history of philanthropy that had earned them park dedications, street names, and a generally unquestioned reputation as pillars of the community. The accompanying documentation, a single typewritten card that had yellowed over the decades, listed the image as Portrait of the Whitmore Daughters, 1856, daguerreotype by unknown artist, donated as part of the Whitmore family papers and memorabilia collection. But Sarah's research revealed that Judge Thaddeus Whitmore, who died in 1894 at the age of 73 and was buried with full honors in Magnolia Cemetery, had no daughters. He had 3 sons, all well documented in census records, tax assessments, property deeds, birth and death certificates, marriage licenses, and the extensive society pages of Charleston's newspapers. The sons were named Thaddeus Jr., Charles, and William. All 3 were photographed multiple times throughout their lives. All 3 left extensive paper trails. There was no evidence anywhere in the historical record of any Whitmore daughters. Sarah spent the next 2 weeks working 16-hour days, her apartment's walls gradually disappearing behind printouts, photocopies, and handwritten notes connected by different colored strings mapping relationships and timelines. She cross-referenced property records from the Charleston County Register of Deeds, census data from the National Archives, shipping manifests from the Port of Charleston's historical records, tax assessments, probate documents, and every scrap of paper that might shed light on who these 6 women were and what happened to them. Her dining table became a command center covered with documents organized into categories: property holdings, slave transactions, family genealogy, business correspondence, legal records. Marcus joined her when he could, though she noticed he took frequent breaks, stepping outside to walk the streets of the historic district where his ancestors had been bought and sold like livestock in the markets that now housed expensive boutiques and tourist trap restaurants. Sometimes he would be gone for an hour, walking routes he knew by heart, pausing at locations that appeared in his family's oral histories. Here, on the corner of Chalmers and State Streets, a woman named Sadie had been sold away from her children in 1847, screaming their names until her voice gave out. There, in front of what was now a bank, a man named Jeremiah had been beaten nearly to death for teaching other enslaved people to read. The weight of what they were uncovering pressed on both of them differently, but with equal force. Sarah came from a family of Chinese immigrants who had arrived in California during the gold rush, building railroads and facing discrimination that was codified into law but rarely discussed in polite company. Her grandmother had told her stories about the Chinese Exclusion Act, about men who died building tunnels through mountains while their white counterparts got the safer, better-paying jobs. She understood in her own way what it meant to have your history erased or distorted, to fight for recognition of suffering that others preferred to forget. But she also recognized that her family's pain, real as it was, existed in a different category from the institutionalized brutality that Marcus's ancestors endured. She could leave Charleston any time she wanted. His ancestors couldn't. That difference mattered. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, the kind of chance discovery that archaeologists and historians dream about but rarely experience. A graduate student named Jessica Hartwell, working on her thesis about domestic servitude in antebellum Charleston, mentioned a reference she'd found in a private journal at the South Carolina Historical Society. The journal belonged to Clara Pemberton, wife of a cotton merchant named Edmund Pemberton, who had made his fortune exporting Sea Island cotton to textile mills in Lancashire, England. Clara's journal, leather-bound and remarkably well-preserved, contained entries spanning from 1854 to 1862, providing an intimate window into the daily life of Charleston's wealthy class during a period of increasing sectional tension that would culminate in war. Sarah and Marcus drove to the South Carolina Historical Society's reading room on Meeting Street, signing in under the watchful eyes of a librarian who seemed suspicious of anyone showing interest in material that might complicate Charleston's carefully constructed heritage narrative. They wore white cotton gloves provided by the institution and turned the journal's pages with the reverence such fragile materials demanded. Most of Clara's entries concerned social calls, shopping trips, complaints about servants, observations about the weather, the kind of mundane detail that makes up most people's lives, regardless of the era. But the entry from March 15th, 1856, was different. Clara wrote about attending a dinner party at the Whitmore estate, describing the house's elegant furnishings, the quality of the food served — she was particularly impressed by the oyster course — and the conversation among the assembled guests, which focused primarily on the political situation in Kansas and the increasingly strident abolition movement in the North. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned something that made Sarah's hands tremble as she read. After dinner, Judge Whitmore invited several of us to tour his property, including the cellar quarters where he keeps 6 Negro girls of remarkable similarity in appearance. He claimed they were sisters, purchased together from the same Virginia estate, and spoke at great length about his theories regarding the management of family groups among the enslaved population. The girls stood in a row, according to height, perfectly still, despite the cold dampness of the cellar. I noticed that the youngest, who could not have been more than 12 years old, had bruises on her arms and seemed barely able to stand without swaying. Sarah felt her hands shake as she read the passage Marcus had pulled up on his laptop. Clara's journal continued with details that made the photograph even more sinister. She described how Judge Whitmore had shown several guests these sisters as if they were curiosities, praising their uniformity and the excellent investment they represented. Clara noted that the youngest appeared to be no more than 12 years old, the oldest perhaps 20. She wrote that one sister had tried to speak, but was silenced by an overseer's raised hand. The journal entry concluded with a detail that connected directly to the photograph. Clara mentioned that Judge Whitmore had commissioned a daguerreotype artist from Richmond to document his collection, as he called it, planning to use such images in correspondence with other wealthy plantation owners to facilitate trades. The photograph Sarah held was not a family portrait. It was a sales catalogue. Marcus's voice was tight when he spoke. My great-great-great-grandmother's name was Patience. She was born in 1844, sold from a Virginia plantation in 1856, and disappeared from all records after that. The family story always said she and her sisters vanished without a trace. He pointed at the screen. This could be her. This could be them. Sarah had studied enough genealogical records to know that documentation of enslaved people was sparse and often deliberately destroyed or falsified. But Marcus's family had maintained an oral history, passed down through generations, with the kind of precision that comes from knowing your story might otherwise be erased. He described his great-great-great-grandmother's sisters, 6 of them, sold together from the Marlowe plantation in Louisa County, Virginia, in early 1856. The youngest was named Grace. She was 12. They needed more evidence, something concrete to connect these 6 women in the photograph to the 6 sisters from Marcus's family history, something that would transform family oral tradition into documented historical fact. Sarah contacted colleagues across the Southeast, requesting access to plantation records, bills of sale, and shipping manifests from early 1856. She sent emails to archives in Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, explaining her research and asking for assistance in tracing the movement of enslaved people from the Marlowe plantation. The response was overwhelming and revealed just how much interest there was in finally telling these stories properly. As word spread about their research through academic networks and social media, other descendants of enslaved families came forward with their own stories of disappearances, of relatives who vanished into Charleston's antebellum economy and were never heard from again. Sarah and Marcus created a shared online database where people could submit family histories, names, dates, and any fragmentary information they had preserved across generations. Within a month, they had over 300 submissions. Within 3 months, that number had grown to over 1,000. Each submission represented a family's grief, their determination to remember, their refusal to let their ancestors be erased. Sarah read every single one, often staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning, her eyes burning from the computer screen, her heart heavy with the accumulated weight of so much suffering and loss. She read about children sold away from parents, spouses separated and never reunited, families deliberately broken apart because enslavers believed that destroying these bonds would prevent organized resistance or escape attempts. Marcus set up a physical bulletin board in Sarah's office, covering an entire wall with printouts, photographs, and handwritten notes. He used different colored pins to mark different types of information: red for confirmed sales, blue for suspected disappearances, green for potential matches between family stories and archival documents, yellow for leads that needed further investigation. The board became a visual representation of Charleston's slave economy, showing the flow of human beings through the market, the networks of buyers and sellers, the systematic destruction of families for profit. The emotional toll of this work was crushing. Sarah found herself having nightmares about the 6 sisters, dreaming that she was in that basement room with them, unable to help, unable to change what she knew was coming. She would wake up in a cold sweat, the image of their dilated pupils and shackled ankles burned into her mind. Marcus struggled too, dealing with the weight of knowing that his ancestor had suffered these specific horrors, that the stories his grandmother told were not exaggerations or metaphors, but literal descriptions of torture and bondage. They supported each other through the difficult days, knowing that this work mattered despite the psychological cost. Sarah brought coffee and pastries to the archive on mornings when Marcus looked particularly exhausted. Marcus insisted they take breaks to walk Charleston streets, pointing out the buildings and locations that appeared in both historical records and contemporary landscapes, helping Sarah understand how the past wasn't really past at all, but present everywhere for those who knew how to see it. 3 weeks into their expanded investigation, Sarah received a call from Dr. Raymond Foster, the curator of historic properties for Charleston's Preservation Society. His voice carried a weight she recognized immediately, the tone of someone who has discovered something they wish they hadn't. "Dr. Chen," he said, speaking slowly, as if each word required careful consideration, "you need to see something. We're renovating the basement of the Whitmore Mansion on Broad Street, and the construction crew found a sealed room. I think it might be connected to your research." Sarah and Marcus arrived at the mansion within an hour, Marcus driving through Charleston's narrow streets with practiced ease, while Sarah sat in the passenger seat reviewing her notes on the Whitmore family. The grand home on Broad Street had been converted into a boutique hotel in the 1970s, its history sanitized and romanticized for tourists who paid premium rates to sleep in what the website marketing materials called antebellum luxury and authentic Southern heritage. The conversion had been celebrated at the time as a triumph of historic preservation, saving a significant building from demolition and generating revenue for the city's growing tourism industry. Dr. Foster met them at the servants' entrance, away from the guests checking in at the ornate front desk, where a cheerful receptionist handed out maps highlighting nearby restaurants and shopping opportunities. His face was pale, his usual professional demeanor cracked by whatever he had seen in that basement. He was in his 60s, a Charleston native who had spent his entire career managing the city's historic properties, and Sarah had never seen him look so shaken. "I need to warn you," he said quietly as he led them down a narrow staircase, the walls closing in on either side. "What's down here? It's not just architectural significance, it's evidence of crimes. I've already contacted the police and the state archaeologist, but I wanted you to see it first because of your research. This connects to what you've been working on." The basement had been partially excavated for the renovation, revealing a network of rooms that didn't appear on any architectural plans filed with the city or preserved in the Historical Society's extensive collection of building documentation. The modern hotel's operations occupied the front sections of the basement: laundry facilities, storage for linens and supplies, mechanical systems for heating and cooling. But the back section, previously sealed behind what everyone assumed was a load-bearing wall, opened into a series of chambers that predated the hotel conversion by over a century. The sealed room Dr. Foster mentioned was behind what had been documented as a wine cellar in property records from the 1890s. When the construction crew broke through the brick wall using jackhammers and crowbars, expecting to find either an empty cavity or perhaps some forgotten bottles, they instead discovered a space approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, with no windows, no ventilation, and a door frame that showed clear evidence of having been fitted with a door that locked from the outside. The door itself was gone, presumably removed at some point before the room was sealed, but the iron hinges remained embedded in the stone doorframe, rusted but still recognizable. The air inside, stale and thick, despite being open for several hours, carried a smell that Sarah couldn't quite place at first. Something old and wrong, like earth that had been sealed away from the sun for too long. Marcus stood in the doorway, unable to enter immediately, his hands gripping the frame so tightly that his knuckles went white. Sarah understood his hesitation. This wasn't just a historical site. This might be the actual room where his ancestors had been held, where they had suffered and counted days and carved their resistance into stone. She entered first, using her phone's flashlight to illuminate the space, since the construction crew's work lights didn't reach this far back into the basement. The walls were rough stone, typical of Charleston construction from the antebellum period, quarried from local limestone deposits and assembled without the mortar techniques that would become standard later in the century. The floor was bare earth, compacted over time, but still showing depressions that might have been left by human bodies lying in the same positions night after night. 6 iron rings were embedded in the stone wall at intervals, suggesting they had been used to secure chains at ankle height, spaced about 3 feet apart in a horizontal line roughly 2 feet above the floor. The metal was corroded, covered in rust that flaked off when Sarah touched it with her gloved finger, but the rings were still firmly anchored in the stone, suggesting they had been installed with the intention of permanent use. The positioning of the rings, their spacing and height, matched exactly the arrangement of the 6 sisters in the photograph, as if this room and that image were 2 halves of the same documentary evidence. Scratched into the stone wall just above where the chains would have hung, barely visible even with direct light, were markings. Not random damage from construction or wear, not natural erosion of the stone, but deliberate etchings made with something sharp but inefficient. Probably a nail or a piece of broken pottery, anything that could be hidden from their captors and used in moments of privacy to create a permanent record. Names. Sarah knelt down on the packed earth floor, her hands trembling as she used her phone's light and camera to document what she was seeing, capturing images that would become central evidence in the case that was building against Charleston's comfortable mythology. The names carved into the stone, reading from left to right in the same order as the photograph's arrangement, were Patience, Ruth, Naomi, Judith, Esther, Grace. The handwriting was crude, inconsistent in size and depth, some letters barely scratched into the surface, while others were carved deep enough to remain clearly legible even after over 160 years. Next to each name was a series of vertical marks, tally marks counting something, likely days of imprisonment. Sarah counted them carefully, documenting each set with multiple photographs from different angles to ensure she had accurate records. 147 marks next to Patience's name, fewer next to the others, descending in order. Next to Grace's name, the youngest, there were only 43 marks before the counting stopped. Marcus's voice came from behind her, barely a whisper. "Those are the names, those are my grandmother's sisters." He stepped into the room, his shoes scraping against the stone floor. The family always said they tried to run, that they disappeared one by one over a summer, and by fall they were all gone. The story was that they made it north, but... He didn't finish the sentence. Sarah documented everything with her camera, taking hundreds of photos, while Dr. Foster coordinated with the city's Historical Preservation Office and the police. The discovery of what amounted to a slave prison in the basement of a celebrated historic property created an immediate political firestorm. By evening, news crews surrounded the mansion, and city officials scrambled to control the narrative. The mayor's office released a statement calling it a regrettable chapter in our city's history and promising a full investigation. But Sarah knew how these things worked. The city's tourism economy depended on a carefully curated version of the past, one that acknowledged slavery with a respectful distance while emphasizing restoration, gardens, and southern hospitality. A story about 6 women chained in a basement, photographed for sale, and buried in unmarked graves would complicate that narrative. Sarah returned to the archive, pulling every document related to the Whitmore family. Property records showed that Judge Whitmore owned significant real estate throughout Charleston County, including several rice plantations and over 200 enslaved people at the time of his death. His will, probated in 1894, made no mention of the 6 sisters. But Sarah found something else in a box of unsorted correspondence, letters between Judge Whitmore and Dr. Samuel Morton, a physician from Philadelphia known for his pseudoscientific racial theories. The letters, dated between 1856 and 1858, discussed Whitmore's experiment with the 6 sisters. He wrote about attempting to break their spirits individually, to study Negro temperament and resistance to proper instruction. The clinical language made Sarah nauseous. These were torture sessions described as scientific inquiry. One letter described how the sisters attempted escape in July 1856. Whitmore wrote that 4 were recovered within days, but 2, the youngest, Grace and Esther, made it as far as the Cooper River before being caught. His punishment was methodical. He separated them further, moving some to different properties, ensuring they could never coordinate another attempt. The letter ended with a chilling line. The problem of unity among these sisters has been conclusively solved. Marcus helped Sarah piece together what happened next. Property records showed transfers of enslaved people from Whitmore's Charleston properties to his plantations in the weeks following July 1856. Bills of sale indicated 2 women, matching the ages of Patience and Ruth, were sold to a plantation in Georgia in August 1856. Another woman, likely Naomi, appeared in records from a Mississippi plantation in September of the same year. The others vanished from documentation entirely. The sealed room in the basement, the chains, the counting marks on the wall, all suggested that before being separated and sold, the sisters were held in that space. Sarah calculated the timeline. If the marks represented days of imprisonment, and if Grace's 43 marks were accurate, she spent approximately 6 weeks in that room before either dying or being removed. The thought of a 12-year-old child scratching days into a stone wall in total darkness made Sarah physically ill. She sat in her apartment that night, unable to sleep, thinking about the photograph. Those 6 women standing in descending height order, their eyes dilated with fear or drugs, their ankles shackled just out of the original frame. Someone had posed them that way deliberately. Someone had seen them as property worth documenting. And for over 160 years, that photograph had sat in an archive, catalogued as a portrait of daughters, while their real names and stories were buried beneath layers of intentional erasure. Marcus called her at 3 in the morning. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Those could be my ancestors, my blood, and we're just now finding out what happened to them. How many others are there? How many people vanished into this city and left no trace?" Sarah didn't have an answer, but she knew the question was important, perhaps more important than the answer itself. The next morning, she received an email from a researcher in Virginia. The Marlowe plantation records had survived, and they confirmed the sale of 6 sisters to a Charleston buyer in February 1856. The names matched: Patience, Ruth, Naomi, Judith, Esther, and Grace. Ages ranged from 12 to 21. The selling price was listed as $6,400, an enormous sum at the time, justified by the note, "Sold as a set, excellent condition, trained in domestic service." The researcher attached scanned images of the bill of sale. At the bottom, in elegant script, was the buyer's signature, Thaddeus Whitmore, and below that, a note in different handwriting. "Delivered to Charleston residence, Broad Street, for domestic service and study of temperament." Sarah printed the documents and spread them across her desk. The photograph, the journal entry, the sealed room, the names scratched in stone, the letters about experiments, the bill of sale. Together, they told a story that Charleston had never fully confronted. Not just the story of slavery in the abstract, but the specific, brutal reality of what happened to real people with names and families and hopes for freedom. She organized a press conference, working with Marcus and a coalition of descendants and historians who had been researching similar cases. The turnout was massive. National media arrived, recognizing the significance of physical evidence that connected specific individuals to documented atrocities. The photograph of the 6 sisters was displayed on a large screen, and Sarah walked through each piece of evidence methodically. She explained how the daguerreotype was never meant to be a family portrait, but a sales tool, how the enhanced resolution revealed shackles and signs of coercion invisible to the casual viewer, how Judge Whitmore's correspondence described the women as subjects of experimentation, not human beings, how the sealed room contained evidence of their imprisonment and their counting of days until whatever fate awaited them. Marcus stood beside her and spoke about his family's oral history, about the power of memory preserved across generations when official records are destroyed or falsified. He talked about what it meant to see his ancestors' names carved into stone, to know they existed and suffered and resisted, even as the city around them tried to erase their existence. The response was divided. Some praised the research as essential truth-telling. Others, particularly those with financial interests in Charleston's tourism industry or descendants of families like the Whitmores, called it revisionist history or an attack on Southern heritage. The mansion owner threatened legal action, claiming the research damaged his property's reputation and business. But something had shifted. Other archives began reviewing their collections with new scrutiny. More photographs emerged, images that had been catalogued as innocuous portraits but revealed, under enhanced examination, similar evidence of bondage and coercion. Bills of sale surfaced from private collections, donated by families who had kept them hidden for generations. The scope of what had been systematically obscured became clearer. Sarah and Marcus's research expanded. They discovered that the practice of photographing enslaved people for sale or documentation was more common than previously acknowledged. The technology of daguerreotype, expensive and time-consuming, had been reserved for people of means, which meant most images of enslaved people were commissioned by those who enslaved them for their own purposes. The subjects had no say in how they were portrayed or what happened to the images afterward. 4 months after the initial discovery, a construction project near the Whitmore family plot in Magnolia Cemetery uncovered unmarked graves. The cemetery, established in 1850 and still operating, had extensive records for white families, but virtually no documentation for the enslaved people buried in unmarked sections. Ground-penetrating radar revealed hundreds of burial sites in areas designated for servants and laborers, a euphemism that obscured their status. The city authorized limited excavation. Among the first graves opened was one containing the remains of a young female, approximately 12 to 14 years old, buried in the mid-1850s. DNA analysis would take months, but Marcus agreed to provide a sample for comparison. The waiting was excruciating. Sarah used the time to continue researching the Whitmore family's connections. She discovered that Judge Whitmore was part of a network of wealthy Charleston families who traded enslaved people among themselves, often keeping detailed records of lineages and characteristics as if breeding livestock. The 6 sisters, chosen for their physical similarities and familial bond, were considered valuable specifically because they were family. The theory, supported by Whitmore's letters, was that blood relations among enslaved people created loyalty that could be exploited or, if broken, would destroy resistance more effectively than physical punishment alone. The experiment Whitmore described in his correspondence was designed to determine whether separating family members after establishing dependence on each other would create more compliant individuals. It was torture masked as social science, and the 6 sisters were his test subjects. Jessica Hartwell, the graduate student who had found Clara Pemberton's journal, discovered more entries from the same period. Clara wrote about seeing Judge Whitmore at several social events in late 1856 and early 1857, always eager to discuss his theories about managing enslaved people. She noted that he seemed particularly pleased with himself, claiming to have solved a persistent problem of escape attempts among related individuals. One entry from December 1856 was especially chilling. Clara described a Christmas party at the Whitmore mansion where the judge boasted that he had successfully separated a troublesome set of sisters, and that their usefulness has increased tenfold now that their misguided loyalty to each other has been eliminated. He went on to describe selling several of them to distant plantations and keeping 2 for continued observation. Sarah cross-referenced this with property records and found transfers matching Clara's timeline. 2 women of the appropriate ages remained on Whitmore's property inventory through 1858. After that, they disappeared from all records. The sealed room in the basement was likely where they were held between the failed escape attempt and their final disposition. The DNA results came back in March. The young female buried near the Whitmore plot was a maternal match to Marcus's family line, confirming she was related to his great-great-great-grandmother Patience. The age and burial date were consistent with Grace, the youngest sister. She had been 12 when sold to Whitmore, and probably 13 when she died, either from illness, injury, or something worse. Her body showed signs of malnutrition and healed fractures, evidence of a short life filled with suffering. Marcus stood in the cemetery as they reinterred Grace's remains with a proper headstone this time. His extended family gathered, some traveling from across the country to witness the acknowledgement of their ancestor. The headstone read, "Grace, born 1844, died approximately 1857. Daughter, sister, remembered." It was simple, but significant. Her name, no longer scratched in stone in a dark room, was carved in marble under the open sky. The ceremony drew hundreds of people, many from families with similar stories of ancestors who vanished into Charleston's slave economy and were never properly mourned. Local news covered it, and the mayor attended, giving a speech about reckoning with the past. Sarah watched from the edge of the crowd, feeling both the weight of what they had uncovered and the inadequacy of any response. Finding Grace's grave didn't answer all the questions. 5 other sisters were still missing. Sarah and Marcus continued searching, expanding their research to plantations across the South where Whitmore's property records indicated sales. It was slow, frustrating work. Many plantation records had been destroyed during the Civil War, either deliberately or as casualties of Sherman's march. Others were held by private collectors who refused access, unwilling to confront what their ancestors had done. But they found fragments. A woman named Patience appeared in a Georgia plantation's inventory from 1856 to 1859, then vanished. Ruth's name appeared in a bill of sale from 1858, sold from a South Carolina plantation to a buyer in Alabama. After that, nothing. Naomi, Judith, and Esther left no trace beyond their original sale from Virginia. The photograph remained the most complete evidence of their existence. Sarah had it reproduced and displayed in the Charleston Museum, with full context about who these women were, what happened to them, and how the image was originally intended to facilitate their commodification. The display included the enhanced version, showing the shackles, the journal entries, the bills of sale, and photographs of the sealed room and Grace's headstone. The exhibit became one of the museum's most visited, and also its most controversial. Tour groups often spent extended time there, some visitors weeping openly as they read the names and details. Others complained, saying it was inappropriate or depressing, asking why the museum couldn't focus on more uplifting aspects of Charleston's history. Sarah gave regular talks about the research, always emphasizing that this wasn't just about the past. The same impulses that allowed Judge Whitmore to torture 6 women in his basement, to photograph them as property, to experiment on them and destroy their family bonds, those impulses still existed. The desire to control others, to profit from suffering, to erase uncomfortable truths. These were ongoing struggles that required constant vigilance. Marcus spoke too, connecting the story to contemporary issues of freedom and resistance. He talked about how his family kept their history alive despite systematic attempts to erase it, how oral tradition preserved truth when official records lied. He emphasized that Grace and her sisters had resisted, had tried to escape, had carved their names into stone so they wouldn't be forgotten. Their story wasn't just about victimization, but about the fundamental human drive for freedom and dignity. A year after the initial discovery, Sarah received a package from a woman in Mississippi. Inside was a photograph, also from 1856, showing a young woman standing beside a cotton bale. On the back, written in faded ink, was a name: Naomi. The sender explained that her ancestor had purchased several enslaved people from a South Carolina estate in 1856, and she had found this photograph among his effects. She was donating it to Sarah's research, hoping to make amends for her ancestors' actions. Sarah compared the photograph to the original daguerreotype of the 6 sisters. The woman in the Mississippi photograph was the same person as the 3rd sister from the left in the Charleston image. Naomi had survived long enough to be photographed again, standing alone this time, her face showing no emotion. Sarah wondered if she knew her sisters were scattered across the South, if she held on to hope of reuniting with them, or if that hope had been crushed. The discovery brought renewed attention to the story. Media coverage expanded beyond regional outlets, with national publications running features about how modern technology was revealing hidden truths in historical images. Other researchers began applying similar techniques to photographs in their collections, finding evidence of bondage, coercion, and resistance that had been invisible to earlier generations. Sarah's work became a model for this new field of inquiry. She published papers about methodology, about the ethics of displaying such images, about the importance of providing context and honoring the humanity of the people depicted. Marcus co-authored several of these papers, bringing his perspective as a descendant and community historian. Together, they established a database documenting enslaved individuals through photographic evidence. It grew to include hundreds of images from across the South, each carefully analyzed and connected to whatever historical records could be found. The database became a resource for genealogists and descendants searching for their ancestors, providing evidence of existence for people who had been systematically erased from official histories. The Whitmore family descendants responded to the publicity with varying degrees of acceptance. Some acknowledged their ancestors' atrocities and supported efforts to document and memorialize his victims. Others denied the evidence, claiming the research was biased or exaggerated. One descendant sued to have his family name removed from the museum exhibit, arguing it damaged his reputation. The lawsuit was dismissed, but it highlighted the ongoing difficulty of confronting historical truth when it implicates one's own family. The mansion on Broad Street never recovered financially. Tourism dropped precipitously after the basement discovery became public. The owner attempted to rebrand it as a site of historical education rather than romantic heritage, but the stigma remained. Eventually, he sold it to a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving and interpreting sites of slavery. The sealed room was converted into a memorial space, with the names scratched into the stone wall, preserved behind protective glass. Sarah attended the memorial's dedication, standing beside Marcus and dozens of members of his extended family. They read the names aloud: Patience, Ruth, Naomi, Judith, Esther, Grace. 6 sisters sold together, separated deliberately, scattered across the South, and largely forgotten until a photograph revealed what had been hidden in plain sight for over 160 years. The ceremony concluded with a reading from a newly discovered letter found in the papers of a Virginia church. Written in 1855 by the mother of the 6 sisters, it was addressed to her daughters, who were about to be sold away from her. The letter, preserved by a sympathetic minister, expressed a mother's desperate hope that they would stay together, take care of each other, and never forget who they were. It ended with a line that Sarah would never forget. "Remember your names. Remember you are free in your hearts, whatever chains they put on your bodies." Standing in the basement where those daughters had been imprisoned, where they had scratched their names into stone to resist erasure, where at least one of them had died, Sarah understood the profound importance of that final instruction. Remembering names, preserving truth, honoring resistance, these acts were themselves a form of freedom, a refusal to let suffering and sacrifice vanish into convenient mythology. The photograph of the 6 sisters remained in the archive, but now it was properly catalogued. Not as the Whitmore daughters, but by their real names: Patience, Ruth, Naomi, Judith, Esther, and Grace. Sisters, daughters, human beings who survived in memory because they refused to be erased, carving their truth into stone and into the hearts of descendants who kept their stories alive across generations. Sarah's research continued, uncovering more photographs, more stories, more evidence of how slavery functioned not just as an economic system, but as a mechanism of psychological torture designed to destroy families and break spirits. Each discovery reinforced the lesson. Freedom isn't just the absence of physical chains. It's the right to own your story, to be remembered as you were, rather than as others chose to portray you, to have your humanity recognized and honored. Marcus's family held an annual gathering at Grace's grave, inviting other descendants of enslaved people to share their stories and honor their ancestors. It became a community tradition, a space for collective memory and healing. Sarah attended each year, bringing new discoveries from her ongoing research, adding names and faces to the historical record. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, but Sarah felt compelled to continue. Every photograph she analyzed might contain someone's ancestor, someone who deserved to be remembered beyond the circumstances of their enslavement. Every name she recovered from obscurity was an act of resistance against the systematic erasure that had allowed comfortable myths about the past to persist. 10 years after discovering the photograph of the 6 sisters, Sarah published a comprehensive book about the research. It included hundreds of photographs, bills of sale, letters, and personal testimonies from descendants. The book became required reading in many history programs, changing how scholars approached antebellum photography and enslaved people's lives. Marcus wrote the foreword, describing what it meant to finally know what happened to his great-great-great-grandmother's sisters, to see their faces, to visit Grace's grave, to understand the deliberate cruelty they endured. He wrote about freedom not as an abstract concept, but as something his ancestors fought for with every breath, even in chains, even in darkness, even when hope seemed impossible. The photograph that started it all, the daguerreotype of 6 sisters standing in descending height order, became one of the most significant historical images in American archives, not because it was beautiful or uplifting, but because it forced viewers to confront an uncomfortable truth. The people who built America's wealth were human beings with names and families and dreams who suffered unimaginable horrors and resisted with remarkable courage. Sarah retired from active research eventually, but the work continued. New scholars took up the project, applying even more advanced technology to historical images, uncovering details that previous generations couldn't see. The database of enslaved individuals she helped create grew to include tens of thousands of names, faces, and stories. On the anniversary of finding the sealed room, Sarah returned to Charleston one last time. She walked through the historic district, past the grand homes built with slave labor, past the market where human beings were sold like livestock, past the cemetery where Grace's headstone stood among hundreds of others, finally bearing names. She thought about the message carved into that basement wall, the counting of days by women who refused to disappear. She thought about freedom. Real freedom, the kind that comes from truth-telling and remembrance, from refusing to let suffering be sanitized or erased, from honoring resistance and preserving memory across generations. The story of the 6 sisters wasn't a happy one. There was no rescue, no reunion, no justice in their lifetimes, but there was truth, finally acknowledged. There were names, finally spoken aloud. There was memory, finally honored. And there was a lesson about the price of freedom and the importance of fighting for it in every generation, because the impulses that destroyed those 6 women's lives, the desire for control, the willingness to dehumanize, the comfort with cruelty, those impulses didn't die with Judge Whitmore or end with slavery. Sarah's last stop was the museum exhibit, where the photograph of the 6 sisters was displayed. She stood before it, looking at their faces, their dilated pupils, their shackled ankles, their enforced solemnity, and she whispered their names: Patience, Ruth, Naomi, Judith, Esther, Grace. 6 sisters who became a photograph, who became a story, who became a testament to the enduring human spirit and the absolute necessity of remembering truth, no matter how painful, because forgetting is a form of bondage all its own. The exhibit had grown over the years. Visitors could now see the enhanced image showing the shackles, read the letters describing the experiments, view photographs of the sealed room and the names scratched into stone, see bills of sale and property records, learn about the failed escape attempt and its consequences, and read testimonies from descendants about what this history meant to their families. At the center of it all was that single photograph, the image that had been catalogued incorrectly for over a century, hiding in plain sight. 6 young women standing in descending height order, their eyes betraying fear, their bodies bearing evidence of bondage, their existence documented for all the wrong reasons. But now, finally, their names were known, their stories were told, their humanity was recognized, and the lesson of their lives and resistance echoed forward. A reminder that freedom is never guaranteed, that truth must be fought for, that memory is an act of defiance against those who would prefer to forget.